sure most of you have heard of Bishop Fulton Sheen. For many years, he was the national director for the propagation of the faith for the United States. So he was all about promoting and raising money and awareness for the evangelization of the church's mission and missionary work. And so he interacted with many missionaries, and one time he was speaking to a priest who had spent many years in the South Pacific, in the island chain. Bishop Sheen asked him, among the native people whom you served, what was their greatest virtue? And the priest responded by saying, well, Bishop, probably the better way to answer that is to tell you what they felt was their greatest vice. And their greatest vice was kai po, which means the sin of eating alone. The missionary said that the people would go 2-3 days without eating until they could share a meal with someone else. You know, it's interesting that the word companion comes from the Latin cum, meaning with, panis, meaning bread, with bread. It means that a companion is one who shares a meal, breaks bread with us. Every time we come to Mass, my friends, every time we come on a Sunday to celebrate the Eucharist, we come as spiritual companions to break bread, to celebrate this Eucharistic feast together. We do not do it alone. Even the word communion comes from commune, to or be in common with. A derivative of community, those who come together in common. They share something in common together. We share the bond of faith, which brings us together as a community of faith. We are friends, spiritual friends, family. Jesus says to the disciples in today's gospel, I no longer call you slaves, because slaves do not know what the master is about. Instead, now I call you friends, because I have told you everything that the Father has told me. It's interesting, the word that he uses for slave, doulos. It can also be interpreted as servant. You are a servant of God. That was nothing to be shameful of. That was a high honor to be called a slave, servant of God, doulos. There was a long and venerable history with that title in the Scriptures. Moses was referred to as the doulos of God, servant, slave of God. His successor, Joshua, was called slave of God. King David in the Psalms is referred to as that slave, servant of God. There was no shame in that honor. It was a privilege. But Jesus now says, I no longer call you that. I call you friend. He's giving them a promotion. friend, philos of God, also had some history in the Scriptures. Abraham, the father of faith, was referred to as the philos, the friend of God. Moses was promoted from servant to now friend of God. Now the disciples are given that title. And perhaps the first thing that they thought of in that word was its association with the kings and the emperors of that time. For the friend of a king had high access to him, priority access. For it was the friends of the king whom would have even access to his private chamber, who would speak to him at the beginning of a day, before he would talk to his advisors and his officials and his generals. It was the friends who would be with the king at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. Now Jesus is saying to the disciples, using that same word, you now are friends of God. No longer will God be someone distant, but now God will be very intimate. You now have high access, priority access to God. The problem, my friends, with being a friend of God, or using that word that Jesus used, being a friend of the king and the emperor, is that when they were overthrown, who was overthrown with them but their closest friends? Moses and Abraham were considered friends of God, but Abraham was called out of his own land and wandered for the rest of his life and was buried in a land he knew not. Moses was promoted to friend of God, but he wandered 40 years in the Sinai desert with an unruly people and was buried in an unmarked grave. Now the disciples are called friends of God. Peter, though, during the time of the Emperor Nero, needed a scapegoat because of the infamous fires that destroyed most of the city of Rome. So he blamed the Christians. Peter was leaving to save his life until we know that story where Domine quo vadis, when he saw our Lord himself going in the opposite direction towards Rome. And he said, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus said, I'm going into Rome to be crucified a second time. And Peter knew that he had to go back. And he went back and taught and preached while the Christians were being persecuted, and he himself was thrown into prison, as well as Paul, until finally Peter was crucified upside down and Paul was beheaded. Friends of God. Then Andrew and James and Simon and Thomas and all the rest, persecuted and martyred. With the exception of John, who was like Abraham and Moses, exiled into a land he knew not on a rocky island named Patmos. Friends of God. I think it sums up best the sentiments of all of this when St. Teresa of Avila, that great saint who had started so many convents and as a result many orphanages and hospitals and schools. She spent most of her time traveling to keep these places going. And on one of her travels during a great storm that washed out the road, and her horse-drawn wagon fell over, destroying most of what it contained, and even she being injured, her leg being hurt. And she wrote in her memoir that she cried out to the Lord, "Lord, this could not have happened at a worse time. I have enough troubles." And she said the Lord answered her, "This is how I treat all my friends." And she said, "If this is how you treat your friends, it's no wonder you have so few." Friends of God. Now, our Lord speaks to us in the Scriptures today and says to us, "I no longer call you slaves, doulos. I call you friends, philos." Wait a minute, Lord. I don't mind being called a servant of God. Don't be afraid, Jesus says. The end of this passage, the end of this chapter, Jesus says, "I will send you an advocate, the divine companion who will give you strength. I will start a church on Pentecost, and you will have many companions to support you. I call you friends." May the Lord then give us the grace. May the Lord then give us that divine companion to bear not just the privilege of being a friend of God, but also the challenge. God bless you.